Hey everyone, my name is Nick Wignall. I'm a clinical psychologist and the founder of The Friendly Mind. And today I'm going to talk to you about rumination. Now, rumination is a mental habit of thinking overly negative and, this is key, unhelpful thoughts about the past. Typically, this takes the form of overly negative and unhelpful thoughts about ourselves and our own kind of failings or faults, but it can also take the form of other people's failings and faults and shortcomings as people. So it often takes the form of kind of complaining or venting about other people, either outwardly or just internally to ourselves in our own head. So this is a problem for a variety of reasons. I mean, for one thing, it can lead to depression in extreme forms, but it can also lead to or exacerbate a lot of anger or aggression problems. And then it can really make worse any kind of struggle with low self-esteem or self-confidence, things of that nature. If you struggle with rumination and you've been kind of frustrated or tired of a lot of the more superficial coping strategies and techniques for dealing with rumination, I'm going to introduce you to 5 very specific, very effective strategies for dealing with rumination, not just in the short term, but in the long term. Because ultimately, rumination is a habit. And like any habit, it can be broken with the right approach. All right, let's dive in. Number 1, stop criticizing your rumination and get curious about it instead. Now, for most people, rumination is actually a double problem. It's a problem first and foremost because rumination itself tends to lead to an increase in both the frequency and intensity of a lot of difficult emotions. Things like shame, regret, guilt, sadness, stuff of that nature. So the more you ruminate, the more you're going to feel a lot more of these difficult emotions, the more frequently you're going to feel them, and the more intensely you're going to feel them. And of course, while there's nothing wrong necessarily with feeling difficult emotions like sadness or regret, if you're feeling them a lot more than you need to because of this mental habit of rumination, obviously that can get tiresome and problematic in the long term. And really, if it gets extremely intense, this habit of rumination, it can actually be one of the core drivers of major depression. So it's really something, even if it's not to that level yet, it's something you want to be aware of and start to work on, because in its extreme forms, it can become very problematic. But the thing is, so rumination itself, like we talked about, is tricky, but it's a double problem because a lot of people who are in the habit of ruminating, they also tend to start ruminating about ruminating. So they say things to themselves like, God, I'm such a ruminator. Like, why do I have to ruminate all the time? Or why do I dwell on this stuff? Why can't I just let it go? I always get fixated on these things and like, what's wrong with me? Stuff like that. So when you ruminate about ruminating, this becomes a double problem now because you're essentially criticizing yourself for ruminating, which leads to even more difficult emotions like shame, regret, sadness, self-directed anger, stuff like that. But you're also making the habit more intense, right? By doing it more and more, you're putting more attention on your rumination, which means your mind is going to be more likely to surface it and bring it up. So rumination is really this kind of double problem where there's the rumination itself, but then there's ruminating about ruminating. But the good news is there's some silver lining to this. People who struggle with chronic rumination, what they don't realize is if they only had to deal with that first layer of rumination, it would actually be a much more manageable problem. See, most people's experience of rumination is this double layer of rumination where they've got rumination and then rumination about rumination. So it seems like this huge problem. But if you can get rid of that second layer of rumination where you're criticizing yourself for ruminating or being a ruminator, rumination actually becomes a lot more tractable of a problem. So how do we do this? Well, one of the best ways I've found to do it is to substitute self-curiosity for self-criticism, especially about your rumination. So if you tend to say things like, God, I wish I wasn't such a ruminator, what you might say instead is like, I wonder what happened to me, either in my environment or maybe it was a thought or a memory, but what happened to trigger this rumination, right? So see how you're not only what you're thinking about, but also your tone of thinking, your internal voice becomes much more curious rather than critical. Or another example might be, instead of something like, God, I wish I wasn't such a ruminator, you could ask yourself like, okay, I'm ruminating. Why am I doing this? Like, what need inside me is this rumination filling? I'm probably getting something out of it. I wonder what that could be. So again, notice this is rather than being critical of yourself, you're getting curious. Now, the benefit of doing this, especially when you start doing it consistently, substituting self-curiosity for self-criticism, is all of a sudden you're doing a lot less criticism of your rumination, which takes away that second layer of rumination. And if you get in the habit of doing this, what it leaves you with is just that first layer of rumination, which again is much easier to tackle and start to break free of without that extra second layer on top of it. So, first thing is, if you struggle with rumination, and especially rumination about rumination, or if you tend to get self-critical about your rumination, try to substitute in a little self-curiosity instead. Number 2, give your rumination a name and a personality. So one of the reasons we get stuck in chronic rumination is because we over-identify with it. And what that means is basically we just start to think of it as core to who we are. Like, I'm a ruminator. So when we start ruminating, it's like the water we swim in. It's just what we do. Oh, there I go. I'm ruminating again, right? In fact, when we really are in the habit of rumination, we don't even think like that. We're not even aware of ruminating because it's such a strong habit. It's just what we're doing. So this is obviously problematic because we end up ruminating a lot more frequently and for a lot longer than we normally would have because, again, we're so enmeshed with it, we're so over-identified with it that we don't even see it. And if you can't see it, it's very hard to break out of it. So one really slightly strange but really helpful way of not being so over-identified with our rumination and instead learning to see it as, yes, this is a part of us, it's a thing I'm doing. It's a mental habit. When you do that, you create distance on your rumination. You see it as a thing that is part of you, but not intrinsic to who you are. And that distance is actually really key for breaking out of the cycle of rumination. Now, one way to do that, it's going to sound a little silly and a little strange, but you want to give your rumination a name and a little personality. And what this does is it reinforces the idea that your rumination is part of you, but it's separate than who you are yourself. It's this little character inside of you, sort of like in the old Disney movie Pinocchio, right? Jiminy Cricket shows up on his shoulder and whispers things to him. So you kind of want to think of your rumination like that, as a little character. And giving it a name and a bit of a personality is one really good way to start doing that. So let's say, for example, that you tend to ruminate about a mistake, a really big mistake you made in your previous marriage, 10 or 15 years ago. And you tend to kind of dwell on it and get stuck thinking about it, especially now that you're in a new relationship. And one of the problems of this rumination, in addition to all the kind of perpetual sort of guilt or shame or regret or self-directed anger that you kind of keep surfacing because you tend to ruminate, it also gets in the way of your current relationship. It's hard to be truly present and sort of focused with your spouse or partner now because so much of your mental bandwidth is going toward ruminating about this mistake in a previous relationship. So let's say that's your situation. Well, you might start to describe or name your rumination as, how about Dweller Dan was the name I came up with because, Dan tends to dwell on the past. So Dweller Dan, right? And then you might even get a little bit more quirky or silly. And you might, let's say, imagine Dweller Dan has big, long donkey ears because you sort of associate Dweller Dan with the donkey from Winnie the Pooh, Eeyore. Remember Eeyore? He's always sort of mopey and kind of dwelling on things and, things are never going to go away, all that kind of stuff. So whenever you start ruminating, what you might do is briefly sort of go, oh, there's Dweller Dan. Hey, Dweller Dan, nice of you to show up. You're welcome to hang out, but actually I'm not going to let you steer the ship of my consciousness right now. So notice what you're doing, that you're doing what psychologists would call externalizing this internal habit. You're putting distance on it. And again, that distance is going to make it easier for you to A, just be aware of it, but then B, break out of it and do something different. Now, one little caveat I will say is you don't want to be mean-spirited about this. So you don't want to get kind of like sarcastic or mean with yourself when you're talking about your little character of rumination. You want to, like a friend who's being kind of annoying, right? You want to be loving and compassionate, but you still want to give yourself space to be a little bit silly and give them a kind of a quirky personality. So that's the only caveat, is don't be mean when you're describing your inner ruminator. But don't be afraid to get a little silly and use a little bit of humor, which again is all in the service of creating some distance on your rumination and learning to see it as a thing that it's a part of you, but it doesn't define you. Number 3, validate the emotions behind your desire to ruminate. Ultimately, rumination is almost always a kind of unhealthy coping mechanism aimed at avoiding some sort of difficult emotion inside of us. For example, in depressive rumination, which is when we spend a lot of time dwelling on our faults or failings or mistakes as a person in the past, what's going on there is we kind of rationalize it as being somewhat productive, but ultimately we know you can't change the past, right? So what rumination is actually doing in this situation is it's often a way to, instead of staying stuck in the feeling of sadness or regret or shame or something like that, rumination allows us to intellectualize. We go from being in our emotion, and to escape that, because it feels uncomfortable, we kind of get into our head and we start telling stories about what happened. And that intellectualization, even though long term, it just tends to lead to more of that difficult emotion, in the very short term, it's an escape mechanism. We get some distance on the feeling itself because we intellectualize. And then there's angry rumination, which is where your rumination is kind of directed toward other people. This often takes the form of criticizing other people or complaining about other people. And it might be out loud, but often it's just in our head. We're just kind of spinning in our head about someone else. Now, what's key to see here is that, again, while we can rationalize it and tell ourselves all these reasons why it's okay or it makes sense to do, ultimately, what's usually going on with angry rumination is we're using it as a defense mechanism for our own faults or insecurities. And the way this works is when you criticize someone else, right? I say you, but of course I do this, we all do this, everybody tends to do this a little bit. But if you really are stuck in this habit, if it's really becoming a problem for you, what's going on is when we do this, criticizing someone else, implicitly what we're saying is when we say, Bob's an idiot, what we're implicitly saying is, but I'm smart, right? Or, she doesn't know what she's doing. These meetings are terribly run, blah, 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 complaining about your boss or your manager. What you're kind of saying is like, but I know how to run meetings really efficiently. Now, the reason that's important is because very temporarily, it's an ego boost. It makes us feel better. It alleviates the pain of some kind of insecurity or fear or anxiety. So what's key to see here in both of these examples is, despite its costs, rumination is always addressing a need within us. It's doing a job, which means that to break the habit of ruminating, you've got to get that need met in a healthier way. So if the need rumination is filling for you, if the job it's doing is to help you avoid or distract from some sort of difficult inner experience, what that means is if you found a better way to deal with those difficult emotions, you wouldn't need rumination. You would essentially put it out of a job. And one of the best ways to do that, to put rumination out of a job, by addressing those emotional needs in a healthier way, is to use a technique and to get good at a technique called validation. Now, validation, it sounds like one of these complicated kind of therapist-y psychologist terms, but really it's super straightforward. And the idea is right there in the name. To validate something, whether you're talking about another person or in our case, one of our own difficult emotions, to validate means to remind yourself that something is valid. So in the case of a difficult emotion, like let's say, guilt. Nobody likes feeling guilty, right? But as much as we don't like guilt and we wish we weren't feeling guilt, it's understandable to feel guilty if we've done something wrong. It's a totally normal emotional reaction. So when you're feeling guilty, to validate that guilt might just mean briefly reminding yourself. And the key is briefly. You're not having a therapy session with yourself here. This is very brief. You know what? I feel guilty. I don't like feeling guilty, but it's okay. It's normal to feel guilty. And the guilt isn't bad, and I'm not bad just because it feels bad. Okay, so that's validated. And you can do that with any kind of emotion, from anxiety to anger to guilt, regret, sadness. All you're doing is saying it's understandable. It makes sense. Even though I don't like it, and I wish it wasn't happening, it makes sense that I'm feeling this way. Now, the benefit of validating difficult emotions is twofold, really. The first is validation kind of takes advantage of you've probably heard of the name it to tame it principle, which is this finding that's been really well established in the research on emotions, is that when you actually lean into and are willing to just sort of label what you're feeling, literally just talk about it in very neutral terms, like I'm feeling guilty, right? I'm feeling regret. That actually takes some of the edge off of the emotional pain. It's not going to make it disappear or go away entirely, but it will kind of take the edge off it. And often just, 10-20% reduction in the intensity of that difficult emotion makes it a lot easier to move on from it in a healthy way. So that's the first thing validation does. But the second thing, and actually the more important thing validation does, is it fosters what's called an approach behavior toward difficult emotions rather than an avoidance behavior. Our tendency when things hurt, including emotional pain, is to avoid them. We either try to get rid of them or run away from them. And while this sometimes succeeds in the sense that we get a little bit of relief, right? When you avoid guilt by kind of intellectualizing and starting to ruminate, you temporarily get some relief. But ultimately, you're going to make those difficult emotions even worse in the long run, because what you're training your brain to think is these painful emotions like regret or guilt or sadness, something like that, they're bad, they're dangerous. Because if your brain sees you running away from something, it's going to assume it's a threat, which means the next time you encounter that thing, it's going to be even more intense because you're going to be anxious about feeling regret or anxiety or shame or whatever it is. So your overall level of emotionality is going to be way bigger. And you're going to be less confident in your ability to handle those difficult emotions well. Because again, you've just been running away from them. So your brain, understandably, thinks you can't handle it. So validation it's really helpful on that front too. When you start approaching difficult emotions instead of avoiding them, you gain both confidence in your ability to handle emotions, which leads to resilience and emotional strength. But it also makes them less intense in the long run because you're teaching your brain that however much they feel bad or dangerous or painful, difficult emotions aren't actually dangerous. So this is why validating those difficult emotions that are behind rumination is it's helpful for how you feel. It's helpful for your overall emotional resilience long term. And then for our purposes, it's actually super helpful for rumination because as you get better at that skill, you won't need to avoid the difficult emotions by ruminating. You won't need to intellectualize to escape the difficult feeling because you've gotten good at validating them. Number 4, practice tolerating helplessness. Now, like we talked about in the previous example, rumination is often used as an avoidance mechanism to get out of or escape some kind of difficult emotion. Now, a specific instance of that is this emotion or set of feelings that we might call helplessness. And so much of the time with rumination, this really is the emotion we're trying to avoid or get rid of or escape, because we are all simply wired to be problem solvers. Like it's just what we do. There's this, I think all of us on some level or another can relate to, we just hop from one problem to another. And of course, there's a lot of benefits to that. Like human civilization is awesome and has flourished in a lot of ways because we are so good at identifying and solving problems. But one of the kind of downsides to being so good, generally speaking, at solving problems is that we get really intolerant of helplessness. And helplessness is simply, it's the emotion we experience when there is a problem or something difficult, but there's nothing we can do about it. And we sort of lose sight of the fact that that is simply the case sometimes. Not every problem is solvable, or not every problem is solvable by us, or not every problem is solvable by us right this instant, which means sometimes we need to tolerate and be with that helplessness. Unfortunately, some of us are not willing to do that, and so we use rumination to avoid that difficult feeling of helplessness. Now, this is understandable because in a lot of ways, it's easy to fool ourselves because rumination seems and is very close to genuine problem solving. When you're ruminating, you're thinking about something negative, something that's a problem, or at least something that feels like a problem, and you're kind of going over and over it, trying to look for solutions, right? Now, when something is a problem and it's capable of being solved by us, this is really helpful, right? But if you're doing that over and over and over again to something that you can't actually solve, you're essentially just banging your head against a wall, right? It's not going to be productive, and it's going to lead to a lot of negative consequences as side effects. Now, at this point, I usually get someone asking me a question about, well, but isn't it good to think about mistakes we've made in the past or to reflect on, errors or missteps we've made so that we can avoid making those again in the future? And what I would say to that is, absolutely. Like, of course, it's good to reflect on our mistakes and try and learn from them. The trouble is, most people are not very good at doing legitimate, healthy reflection. Instead, they use reflection as sort of even if this is just kind of unconscious, they end up using it as an excuse to keep ruminating. So you have to be able to distinguish genuine healthy reflection from rumination. And there's a few ways to do this. There are three in particular that I really like that I'll share with you right now, because I think this is really helpful. The first is, are you thinking about this mistake or misstep or failure in the past? Are you thinking about it reactively or deliberately? Almost always, true healthy reflection is done deliberately and thoughtfully. It's not impulsive and reactive. On the other hand, rumination almost always is impulsive and reactive. But sort of put another way, we tend to find ourselves ruminating. We just end up doing it. Whereas healthy reflection, you make sort of a plan and you do it consciously and thoughtfully and intentionally. Okay, so that's the first thing you want to look out for. Is this my habit of thinking about the past? Am I just doing it reactively and impulsively and sort of falling into it? Probably rumination. Or am I doing it thoughtfully and deliberately? Have I planned out a time to think about this thing in kind of a systematic, intentional way? Well, then it might actually be healthy reflection. Now, the second one is you want to think about your tone of voice. That sounds a little strange, tone of voice. Well, so just like in speech, right, when you're talking to someone else, often kind of how you say something is just as important as what you're saying. So the tone, your tone of voice really matters for how that message is going to be received. Similarly, when you're talking to yourself, and rumination really is a form of self-talk. When you're talking to yourself, what's your tone of voice? In healthy reflection, your inner tone of voice is usually very generous and sort of thoughtful and balanced, neutral even, compassionate maybe. Whereas when you're doing rumination, the tone of voice it's kind of mean-spirited. It's kind of critical. It's got this real harsh sort of edge to it. So that's another way to sort of differentiate. Am I actually doing healthy reflection or am I ruminating? And what you want to do is pay attention to the tone and think through, is it kind of balanced and generous or is it kind of mean-spirited and critical? And then now the last kind of sign that will help you differentiate healthy reflection versus unhelpful rumination is simply, and this one seems obvious, but it's surprisingly hard to be truly honest and objective with ourselves about it. But you want to ask yourself, is this actually helping? Is me thinking about this mistake in the past, is it really helping in a productive way? And so there's a few questions you can kind of ask along these lines. So you might say, like, have I actually learned anything new about this situation? Another would be, has thinking about this thing in the past, has it actually changed my behavior in a meaningful way? And then the last one would be, do I have actual evidence that because of all this thinking about this mistake in the past, I am now avoiding this mistake more often in the future? And I think if you really go through those questions and sort of ask and answer themselves honestly to yourself, you will almost always realize not really, right? This thinking is not especially helpful or productive. That's a sign that you're ruminating and that it's not really about learning or changing. It's addressing some other psychological need. It's helping you avoid a difficult emotion. So that's really key to differentiate and to get good at differentiating for yourself unhelpful rumination versus healthy reflection. Now, to get back to helplessness, which is kind of the main idea in this section, if you struggle with chronic rumination, you must get better at tolerating your helplessness instead of using rumination to avoid it. Because again, you can sort of put rumination out of a job, so to speak, if you can deal with that need it's addressing in a healthier way. And one of the specific emotional needs that rumination is often addressing is it's a way to avoid helplessness. But if we can deal with helplessness in a better way, besides just avoiding it, we won't need rumination, and it'll be much easier to break out of that habit. Now, one of the ways to do this is to increase our tolerance of helplessness. One of the reasons we're so bad at dealing with helplessness and we need rumination to kind of numb ourselves out to it is because we just never practice building up a tolerance to it. Now, tolerance is it's an important term. So I always think about I remember learning to play guitar. When you first learn to play guitar, one of the most difficult things about it is your fingertips hurt all the time, right? Because you're pressing them down hard against these, sometimes nylon, but often kind of metal guitar strings, right? And it hurts. And it hurts for a while until you build up calluses on your fingers. But eventually, if you keep practicing, your fingers do develop calluses and they get tougher. They develop a tolerance to this behavior of pressing down on metal strings. And so it doesn't hurt nearly as much. So we want to apply a similar idea to helplessness. You can actually build up a tolerance to helplessness so that you can be willing to feel it without needing to try and distract yourself from it with something like rumination that has so many negative side effects. Now, this is hard, obviously, especially at the beginning, but if you think about in any area of life, to build up tolerance to something difficult, you got to start small and work your way up. So the key is you actually want to look for relatively small instances of helplessness in your life and then use them as opportunities to practice. So for example, like one that I like a lot is, well, I don't like it. I like it as an opportunity to practice tolerating helplessness. But let's say you're stuck in traffic. This is a classic case of kind of a minor, usually a pretty minor amount of, but helplessness. You can't do anything about the cars in front of you, right? So instead of kind of complaining or ruminating about it in your head, you can use it as an opportunity to practice tolerating the helplessness, telling yourself, okay, I really don't like feeling helpless. I'm kind of mad too about all this, but it's okay. I'm going to be willing to feel helpless. Now, when you do that, right, and the key is willingness is the key word there. You have to have the feeling and be willing to do it. And when you do that enough, your tolerance will build because what you're telling your brain, you're teaching your brain that, again, despite it feeling bad, this thing, helplessness, it isn't actually bad. And when you practice that enough, you start to change your belief about emotions and about helplessness to where you start to become very confident in your ability to have helplessness and just have it and not do anything about it. And as that belief starts to get bigger because you're practicing tolerating helplessness, your need for ruminating will dramatically drop. And that is one of the best ways to break out of this habit of chronic rumination. Number 5, use the 3 M's to break out of rumination spirals. So far, all the strategies and techniques we've talked about have been all about helping you change your internal behaviors. So being curious, not critical with your rumination, right? Giving your rumination a name and helping kind of externalize it. Or validating the emotions behind rumination, including helplessness and kind of building up your tolerance to helplessness. All of these are sort of, you can think of them as sort of mental habits and techniques. But how you behave physically in response to rumination is actually really important too. And the reason it's important is because these more mental or cognitive habits that I've described, they're good in very small doses, right? They're good at kind of changing your basic orientation to rumination. But they have a downside, which is that if your only response to rumination is sort of cognitive and more mental, it's very easy to stay overly focused on the rumination. And even if you're doing really healthy, productive kind of mental approaches to rumination, you are still focusing on it, which reinforces it to your brain. The more attention you give it, the bigger and more important a thing your brain thinks it is. And the end result of that is your brain is just going to throw more ruminations at you. So one of the best habits you can get into to ultimately break the habit of rumination is once you've done some of those good mental things like being curious and not critical or validating the emotions behind rumination, what you actually want to get in the habit of doing is moving on from whatever's going on in your head and getting back to your life and like what's important to you, particularly physically, like just literally doing something different. Now, this is hard, understandably, right? When you're stuck in a real spiral of rumination, even if you do those things like validating and not being critical. So I've developed this simple little framework that I call the 3 M's, which is a set of behaviors that I've found to be especially helpful of breaking out of different forms of overthinking like rumination. And the 3 M's, they stand for move, which is all about moving your body and physically, doing something. Make, which is about literally making or fixing something, often using your hands. And then meet, which involves having a meaningful interaction or conversation with somebody else. Now, the one key caveat here is you don't want to use the 3 M's as an avoidance strategy. It is important to acknowledge and validate the rumination and the emotions behind them very briefly first. But once you've done those things, it's key to realize you don't have to keep staying stuck on the rumination. You don't need to process it indefinitely. And usually the most helpful thing you can do is physically, literally move on from it. Okay, and you can use the 3Ms. So just as some examples of what the 3Ms might look like. Let's say the rumination struggle you have is you're at work and you're ruminating about this mistake you made last quarter and how it might affect your job and even like your career prospects, and it's getting in the way of you being able to work, and it's just becoming a real problem at work. So if that's the case, you might, the first M, let's say you find yourself ruminating at your desk, you might think, okay, move. So I'm going to get up, I'm going to take a break, and I'm going to go for a 15-minute walk around the block or in the park across the street from my office, something like that. So let's move. Make. You might, this sounds a little silly, but it really, really works, is you might decide, that squeaky hinge on my office door, I'm going to walk down to CVS, I'm going to get some WD-40, and I'm going to fix that squeaky hinge. Right? Or meet. So you might, shoot a message to one of your coworkers and say, hey, you want to meet for coffee for 20 or 30 minutes, take a break, or maybe get lunch, and talk about that TV show you both like, something like that. Now, there's nothing special about these three things other than I have personally in my life and with clients and people I've worked with on rumination, seems to be something kind of especially helpful about these three types of things. But I'm just saying it's not exclusive. There's all sorts of behaviors you could use to break out of and move past a rumination spiral. But the 3Ms can be especially helpful. What's important to take away from this is that once you've briefly acknowledged and validated your rumination and the emotions behind it, you don't need to spend a ton of time processing it. And actually, the best thing you can do is move on. And the 3Ms are just an especially helpful way I've found to think about and start doing that. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it helpful. If you'd like to get more ideas and essays and videos from me about rumination and other similar topics in emotional health, I write a free weekly newsletter called The Friendly Mind, which you can subscribe to, and I would love to have you as part of our community.